You have never had an original thought in your life. Not because you're unoriginal, not because you copy other people, but because underneath every idea you've ever had, there's a layer of your mind that was never yours to begin with. Inherited, wordless, and older than your name. You think you decide what frightens you. You think you decide who you fall in love with, what you find beautiful, what feels sacred, and what feels obscene. Carl Jung spent decades arguing that you decide almost none of it. Something decided before you arrived, and it is still deciding, now, quietly, underneath the version of yourself you call me. Think of the last time you felt a fear with no clear cause, or an ache for something you couldn't even name. You didn't build that feeling. It was simply there, waiting, before you had a reason for it. This is not a metaphor. Jung meant it as something closer to anatomy, a structure of the psyche as real, in his view, as the structure of the eye or the hand. And if he was right, then the story you tell about your own mind, that it started blank and filled up with your personal experience, is not just incomplete, it's backwards. Most people, when they hear unconscious, picture a personal basement. Forgotten memories, repressed embarrassments, things you pushed down because they hurt. That basement exists. Freud built his whole system around it. But Jung looked at that basement and asked an uncomfortable question. If the unconscious is just leftover personal material, why do people who have never met, never read the same books, never shared a culture, keep producing the same images? Why does a child who has never seen a snake recoil from one instinctively? Why do myths from Japan, from the Yoruba, from Norway, from cultures with no contact for thousands of years, keep circling the same handful of characters? The wise old figure, the devouring mother, the shadowy double, the descent into darkness before rebirth. Coincidence explains one myth. It does not explain a pattern that repeats across the entire species. Jung didn't arrive at this conclusion from a comfortable distance. In 1913, after breaking with Freud, he went through several years of what he later called a confrontation with the unconscious, waking visions and dreams so vivid and disturbing that he genuinely feared for his own sanity. He kept a private record of what surfaced during that period, material eventually published long after his death as the Red Book. It wasn't detached theorizing that convinced him something impersonal was moving beneath the personal mind. It was watching it happen to him first, in images he hadn't chosen and couldn't simply will away. So Jung proposed something that still unsettles people who take it seriously. Beneath your personal unconscious, the one built from your own memories, there is another layer, not personal, not built from your life at all. He called it the collective unconscious, and he meant that the human psyche comes preloaded with structural patterns, the way a body comes preloaded with organs. You didn't learn to have a shadow side any more than you learned to have a spine. So what exactly did he think we inherited? Not memories, not specific pictures, something stranger and much harder to pin down. He called these inherited patterns archetypes, and this is where almost everyone gets Jung wrong, so it's worth being precise before going further. An archetype, in Jung's own framework, is not a picture. It's not a specific image of a wizard or a witch or a dragon sitting somewhere in your brain, waiting to be triggered like a stored photograph. Jung was explicit that this misreading, treating archetypes as inherited pictures, collapses his entire argument into folklore. What's inherited, on his account, is something closer to a mold, an empty form, a disposition to organize experience in a certain shape. The content that fills that shape comes from your culture, your era, your language. The shape itself does not. Has this ever happened to you? You meet someone for 30 seconds and something in you already knows how to feel about them. Trust, unease, fascination, long before they've said anything to earn it. That instant reaction, arriving faster than thought, is exactly the kind of moment Jung pointed to. Not proof by itself, but a small, everyday clue that something underneath is doing the sorting before you get a vote. Think of it less like a photograph passed down through your genes, and more like a riverbed. The riverbed doesn't contain water. It doesn't decide what the water looks like, what temperature it is, where it came from, but it decides where the water goes. Pour experience into a human mind in any century, on any continent, and it tends to carve the same channels because the riverbed was already there. Sit with that for a second. If there's a structure underneath your personality that you didn't build and can't fully see, the person you think you are is not the whole picture. Here's the unsettling part. That architecture leaves fingerprints right in your ordinary, everyday behavior. Start with the one almost everyone recognizes without knowing its name, the shadow. Not evil in the moral sense, though it often gets treated that way. The shadow, in Jung's account, is simply everything about yourself that got rejected. The impulses, desires, and traits you learned, usually as a child, were unacceptable to show. Not because they are inherently monstrous, but because your particular family, your particular culture, decided they didn't fit the version of you that was allowed to exist. So they didn't disappear, they went underground, into that same layer where the archetypal structures live, and they started operating from there instead. Outside your awareness, but not outside your behavior. Now, notice what follows. This is why Jung made a claim that still holds up uncomfortably well. The traits that irritate you most intensely in other people are very often disowned pieces of yourself, looking back at you from a face that isn't your own. Not always. Not every irritation is a mirror, but the ones that carry unusual heat, the reactions that feel disproportionate to what actually happened, those, Jung argued, are usually the shadow doing what it does best, showing up as somebody else's problem. Picture something small and specific. A coworker who talks over people in meetings, and it bothers you far more than it seems to bother anyone else at the table. You tell yourself it's about professionalism. Jung would ask a ruder question. Is there a version of you, somewhere back in childhood, that learned loud confidence wasn't allowed and buried it? The irritation isn't proof, but its size, out of proportion to the offense, is exactly the kind of signal Jung trained his attention on. Or the reverse, someone who is endlessly, almost embarrassingly kind, and you find yourself strangely suspicious of them, waiting for the mask to slip. That suspicion often has less to do with them than with a part of you that learned, a long time ago, that kindness this open wasn't safe to trust, or wasn't safe to show. Before going further, there's a bigger claim waiting just underneath this one. Because if this pattern works for one irritated coworker, it raises the uncomfortable question of what happens when an entire country feels the same irritation, at the same target, at the same time. Notice what this does to the comfortable modern idea of the self-made, self-transparent individual. Jung's model suggests you are, in part, built out of everything you refused to be, and that your conscious personality is only the visible tip of something with roots you can't inspect directly, because the part doing the inspecting is the same part with the blind spot. The shadow, though, is only personal material, organized by an archetypal pattern. Your own rejected traits, poured into an inherited channel. The deeper claim, the one that actually separates Jung from ordinary psychology, is that some of what surfaces from that underground layer isn't personal at all. It didn't come from your childhood. It came from being human. Take the pattern Jung called the Anima Animus, his term for an inner figure, gendered opposite to the individual's own, that shapes how a person experiences attraction, meaning, and the unknown. Jung's own framing of this idea was heavily shaped by the gender assumptions of early 20th century Europe, and later thinkers, including many who admired him, have pushed back hard on how rigidly he drew the line. Strip away the dated packaging, though, and the underlying observation is harder to dismiss. People fall for other people in patterns that look less like free selection and more like recognition, as though something in them already had a shape, and they were searching the world for whoever matched it. That shape, on Jung's account, was in part archetypal, an inherited disposition toward a certain kind of otherness, which each person then fills in with the specific faces of the people they actually meet. If that's even partly right, it means falling in love is stranger than it feels from the inside. You are not simply encountering another person and deciding freely that you like them. You are running an inherited template against the world and reacting most strongly to whoever happens to fit it. The selection feels personal. The shape doing the selecting might not be. You have probably felt this without naming it. Meeting someone new and feeling within minutes an odd sense of familiarity you can't account for. Not memory, not déjà vu exactly, just a feeling that some part of you already had a place reserved for them. To be precise, Jung wasn't arguing love is an illusion or that the person doesn't matter. His claim was narrower, that the intensity of certain attractions points to an inherited disposition doing part of the work underneath the conscious relationship. What he's questioning is only the story that the pull toward them was purely, freely chosen from nowhere. Here is the moment where the whole shape of the argument shifts, and it isn't a twist added for effect, it's the plain consequence of everything just established. If the shadow and the anima are not personal quirks, but inherited architecture, then the version of you that irritates a coworker or falls for a particular kind of stranger was never operating alone. The same channels exist in the coworker, in the stranger, and in millions of people who have never met you and never will, which means the you doing the reacting is not, in that moment, entirely singular. It is one outlet of something structural, running in parallel through an entire population at once. That is not only a claim about your love life or your annoyance at a colleague. It is about what happens when the same shared channel opens in millions of people simultaneously. Because at that scale, the individual mind stops being the right unit to study at all. Sit with that. The real implication isn't what most people think when they hear collective unconscious. It isn't a comforting idea about humanity being secretly connected. It's the opposite. A claim that your most private reactions might not be private at all. This is where the collective unconscious stops being a quiet biographical detail and starts explaining something genuinely dangerous. Jung watched fascism take hold of Germany in real time, and he did not treat it as a purely economic or political event. His interpretation, controversial in its own day and still debated by scholars now, was that a nation's disowned brutality and resentment had gone underground the way an individual's shadow does, then found a shared outlet, a leader who let an entire culture externalize what it could not face in itself, and a scapegoat onto whom that shadow could be projected wholesale. This is a strong and contested interpretation, not an uncontroversial historical fact. Serious critics argue it lets ordinary political and economic causes fade too far into the background. But it explains something the purely rational accounts struggle to: the emotional temperature, why people wept at rallies, why cruelty became communal celebration instead of private shame. If Jung was even partly right, that shared lightness was a shadow being projected outward at the size of a nation. Before going further, the theory deserves its strongest objection, because Jung's critics have a genuinely serious case. The most common charge is that the collective unconscious is unfalsifiable. No matter what pattern appears across cultures, the framework can absorb it and call it archetypal, without ever specifying what evidence would prove the idea wrong. Picture two children on opposite sides of the planet who have never seen a photograph of each other's countries, both waking from a nightmare about falling into darkness. Nobody taught them that image. That small coincidence is the entire debate in miniature. Is something ancient stirring in both of them, or did two separate brains, built the same way, simply arrive at the same fear on their own? Critics working from an evolutionary or cognitive science background argue that shared imagery doesn't require an inherited psychic structure at all. Similar bodies and similar dangers could produce similar myths through ordinary lived experience, without anything passed down psychically. On this view, the pull isn't inherited. It's just what happens when different lives cross the same terrain. So which is it? Something inherited, or something each generation rebuilds from the same raw materials? That question doesn't have a clean answer, and it's worth sitting with before moving on. Jung never had the tools to answer it cleanly, and neither yet does anyone else. But he was describing something observed with striking consistency across dreams, myths, and clinical cases decades before there was any real way to test it. What's hardest to dismiss is the pattern itself. Even a skeptic has to explain that. Which raises the question the video has been building toward without saying it outright. If this architecture is inherited, if it operates whether or not you're aware of it, and if under the right conditions it can seize an entire population, then what exactly is the difference between having a mind of your own and simply being a vessel these older patterns pass through? There is an answer on Jung's account, but it isn't the one people expect, and it doesn't involve getting rid of any of this. Go back to 1913 for a moment. Jung didn't survive that crisis by pushing the visions away. He did something almost nobody would have the nerve to try. He sat with the disturbing figures that appeared in his mind, treated them as if they were real, and let them speak instead of silencing them as symptoms of a breakdown. That method, which he later called active imagination, only worked because he stopped trying to defeat what was surfacing and started trying to know it. That's the uncomfortable question this raises for anyone watching. Not how do I get rid of the parts of my mind I don't like, but what happens if I actually look at them instead? It's worth pausing on a much smaller, much less historic example of the same mechanism, because it makes the point without the weight of a world war attached to it. Nobody designing a modern content feed has read Jung's collected works, and no algorithm was built with archetypes in mind. Think of the last video that made you angry enough to keep watching past the point where you meant to stop. Chances are it had a villain who clearly deserved punishment, and someone innocent being wronged. Nobody scripted that formula because they'd studied Jung. It simply performs, and the app kept it because it works. Look at what actually goes viral. A public cancellation, a betrayal caught on camera, a clean villain in a political fight, an outsider blamed for a group's problems. Different platforms, different countries, same handful of shapes, over and over. Platforms didn't invent these stories. We discovered we were already wired for them. But an algorithm optimizing for attention will, by trial and error, converge on whatever reliably seizes it, and the material that performs best looks remarkably archetypal. This is an application of the underlying idea to a phenomenon Jung never analyzed, not a claim that he predicted social media. If human attention really is structured around a small set of recurring patterns, a system built purely to capture attention will find those patterns automatically, the same way water finds the lowest channel without needing to understand geology. The frightening part isn't that engineers rediscovered the shadow, it's that they didn't need to know it existed to exploit it. That's the harder answer, and it's more demanding than either extreme people expect. But here's what makes this even stranger. Jung did not believe you should eliminate the unconscious material, the way pop psychology readings of shadow work now suggest, hunting the dark side down and either purging it or performing it as edgy authenticity. Nor could you simply outthink the archetypes, reasoning your way to a mind untouched by inherited structure. You did not choose this. You cannot unchoose it either. What he proposed was a slower, less satisfying process he called individuation, the lifelong work of bringing unconscious material into conscious relationship, not eliminating it, not obeying it, knowing it well enough that it stops running you from the dark. In practice, this rarely happens through argument or willpower alone. Jung pointed instead to the places unconscious material already leaks through on its own. Dreams, disproportionate reactions, the patterns you keep repeating despite meaning to do things differently. You already know this pattern, even without the vocabulary. Snapping at someone over something small and only realizing days later what you were actually reacting to. That delay is exactly the terrain Jung is describing. So where does anyone actually start? Not with a technique, but with a single, repeatable habit. Noticing the moment a reaction feels bigger than the situation deserves, and staying with that gap instead of explaining it away. asking what it says about a part of yourself you haven't been willing to look at directly. Asked honestly, over years rather than once, that question is closer to individuation than any ritual. There is no single dramatic moment where the unconscious becomes visible all at once, only the slow accumulation of instances where you catch the pattern a little earlier than last time. This is not a promise of a fully transparent self. Jung was explicit that total self-knowledge isn't something the psyche allows, no final graduation into a person with no blind spots left. Individuation is a direction, not a destination, which brings the argument back to where it started, but changed. You have never had an original thought, not the one you are having right now, not the reaction you had 5 minutes ago, not the feeling of certainty you brought into this video. Somewhere underneath the version of you that has opinions and preferences and a name, there is a structure inherited from every human being who came before you, a riverbed carved long before you were born, still deciding, in ways you can only partly see, which of your reactions are truly yours, and which ones are simply water finding the channel it was always going to find. The unsettling part isn't that this architecture exists, it's that most people go their entire lives mistaking the riverbed for the water, certain that every reaction, every attraction, every hatred is a fully personal choice, when some of it was decided by something far older than they are, and only wearing their face. This week, watch for the moment your own reaction feels bigger than the situation deserves. An irritation, a sudden pull toward a stranger, a suspicion with no clear source. When you catch one, sit with it for a second before explaining it away. And if you're willing, say what you noticed in the comments. Not to solve it, just to see whose reaction it actually was. Until the next video.